Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Love Boise State Public Radio podcasts? They are free to enjoy, but not free to produce. If you can give, your support helps keep shows like Idaho Matters and Scandalize available to everyone. Donate now at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. We're going to spend the next hour getting you updated on the news that made headlines this last week. There was a lot to get to today, and our panel today includes Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun, Caitlin Hart with EastIdahoNews.com, Max Silverson, editor of the Star News, and Rachel Cohen, reporter with the Mountain West News Bureau. Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Good to have you with us today.
Happy Friday, Gemma.
Friday.
So, Clark, let's begin with the fact that after 81 days, the Idaho legislature wrapped up the 2026 legislative session late last week. And it was marked by some big budget cuts, by some big debates, and then arguments over fiscal responsibility. So, Clark, you were there for all of it. Let's begin with the budget. Lawmakers approved across-the-board cuts to most state agencies during the session. Can you talk to us about what drove the decision and what are agencies saying about how those reductions could impact the services they provide?
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. You're exactly right. Kind of the thing that dominated so much in the 2026 legislative session was the budget cuts. And so the reason that the legislature and Governor Brad Little pursued these budget cuts was in order to avoid a budget deficit and to pay for state and federal tax cuts. Over the last 5 years, the legislature had cut state income tax rates by a combined total of $4 billion, including $450 million last year in tax cuts alone. That's kind of colliding with these federal tax cuts that President Donald Trump signed into law last summer in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Idaho also complied retroactively with those new federal tax cuts. And so what those tax cuts do is they reduce the amount of money that individuals and businesses pay in taxes, but that also cuts the amount of money that's available for the state budget to pay for the essential programs and services that the state provides. And so that's the reason that the budget cuts were initiated. It's important to point out that these are the biggest budget cuts that Idaho has undergone since the Great Recession, since roughly 2011 or so. But these cuts, Republicans and Democrats alike are saying these cuts were a self-inflicted problem caused by the legislature cutting taxes too much and not adopting a realistic revenue figure to build the budget around. And so it's all about avoiding a budget shortfall, which would violate the Idaho Constitution, and making room and paying for the state and federal tax cuts that are kind of coming together at roughly the same time period, Gemma.
So, Clark, a number of high-profile bills, and we're talking issues like LGBTQ plus flags, transgender rights, Medicaid work requirements, these passed this session. So, in your opinion, having covered the session, which of those measures are expected to have the biggest impact?
Yeah, I think several of them are going to, and I think we're going to see as the year plays out the exact impact. But when you talk about, so what passed this year that's going to affect some folks, Governor Little signed into law House Bill 752, which makes it a crime for people to, quote, knowingly and willingly enter a bathroom, a locker room, or a changing room that is designed for persons of the opposite biological sex. Now, the opponents of this new law said it's all about and is designed to punish trans people who use the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity. This was a law that led to a lot of debate. There were questions about how exactly could law enforcement enforce some of the provisions of this law.
Hmm.
So there were a lot of questions about this. There could be legal challenges about this. That's something that's going to affect people. The Idaho legislature also passed another bill, House Bill 822. It's called the Pediatric Secretive Transitions Parental Rights Act. And what that bill would do is require teachers and doctors to out transgender children to their parents. And so you're absolutely right, Gemma, that in addition to the budget cuts, which are going to affect programs and services, there were a number of bills that affected members of the LGBTQ plus communities, as well as House Bill 913, which calls for the state to implement work requirements by the end of the year for adults who are enrolled in Medicaid expansion in order to receive those benefits. And so a lot of the conversations around the state capitol building this year talked about how those bills will affect people and what the effect of those bills will be this year, Gemma.
So, Clark, stepping back, this session was described by some lawmakers as chaotic. Also, some lawmakers have said it lacked transparency. What were the biggest political tensions or divisions that defined the session this year?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of different things, and you're absolutely right. The tension and sort of chaos was a big part of it. But there's a fight between the legislative branch of government and the governor's office, which is playing out right now, which I think we'll talk about after the next commercial break. But the budget
Hmm.
cuts also led to a lot of division within the Idaho legislature. I think we got to a point where a lot of folks agreed that we needed to cut the budgets or delay the implementation of the tax cuts. I think a lot of folks were realizing there was going to be a budget problem, but the tension and the chaos and the divisiveness comes in with people disagreeing with the process on how to handle the budget crunch that the state was undergoing. Democrats said the most responsible thing to do, Gemma, would be to delay the implementation of some of the state level tax cuts until the budget stabilized, and there would be less of an impact on some of the services and programs that state pays for. Republicans in the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee chose to enact additional budget cuts for a total of 4% this year and 5% next year for almost all state agencies and departments. And some Republicans wanted to go even farther and cut the budget even more. And so there was disagreement over how much to cut. But then Republicans and Democrats, so you have legislators from both parties saying the way they did these cuts was lazy and sloppy. They applied the cuts to almost everybody the same, regardless of the need or the value for the programs that were out there. And they also said that the cuts themselves were really, really hard to find out exactly what the impact was going to be and exactly what programs were going to be affected. There were these big 50 plus page bills that contained all the cuts. And they talked about dollar amounts, but they didn't single out the impacts on specific programs. And so legislator after legislator stood up and said, when this legislative session adjourns and you go back and you talk to your constituents in a town hall and they say, show me what was cut, you're going to have a really difficult time identifying that and pointing that out. So it was all about how we cut and the process for cutting and whether that was responsible and transparent to the public or whether it was rushed and applied unevenly. And I think the concern is we may not know the impact of some of these cuts until we get to the end of the fiscal year and into the next
Hmm.
budget year, that we'll sort of see them play out over the summer and into the fall before we head into the 2027 legislative session next January, Gemma.
All right. Thanks for that update, Clark. So, Caitlin, you've been following a story that has made national headlines as law enforcement continued to piece together what happened last week. There was a deadly shooting near Pocatello, and it left 3 people dead, 2 others injured, and then it ended with police fatally shooting the suspect. So, Caitlin, can you walk us through what investigators now know about the timeline of events? And this all happened in an area that's called Tank Farm Road, and how this situation unfolded.
Right, yeah. So the shooting took place sort of over by the Simplot plant, but actually in Power County. It's still really close to Pocatello. It's near Chubbuck, but essentially on Friday, last Friday, we learned that an emergency call had come in telling dispatch that three people had been shot on Tank Farm Road, and it's a pretty remote area, like where it is specifically. It's not far from the town, but there's just not a lot of buildings, not a lot of people out there.
Hmm.
And a little while later, we heard that there were many agencies responding. Around 2:50 p.m., I think, is when Sheriff Casey Candle of Power County heard that there was something going on, and so we learned that Pocatello, Chubbuck, and American Falls, as well as ISP, Port of Air Rescue, Pocatello, Fort Hall, and Power County were all dispatched. At that point, is when we sent a reporter out there. My coworker Logan Ramsey was on scene for that. At the time, we were able to catch video of two armored law enforcement vehicles. So they had, Southeast Idaho Special Tactics and Response out there. The Pocatello Police Department had a Bearcat. It was a really big deal. So eventually, we had learned that two people at a building had been shot, but we didn't know the actual extent of that. We didn't know their
Hmm.
status at all. And eventually, we did learn that a third person was shot that was apparently an innocent bystander in a boat nearby, in like a nearby water area.
Hmm.
And at that point, officers had located who we believe to be the shooter down kind of by the Portneuf River. And the officer involved did shoot and kill the person they believed to be the shooter. So we recently found out this week the identities of the two people who were shot at the building. One of them
Hmm.
was Brandon Lee Madden, and the other was Amanda Ann Christensen of Pocatello. They are brother and sister. We don't know a lot about the circumstances of the shooting. We don't know a lot about their connection to the shooter, who was identified on Wednesday, actually, as Richard Todd Forrest of Pocatello. We're not sure how they're connected yet, but there was one person that did survive being shot, the man on the boat that wasn't involved in the shooting at all. But that means that there's two investigations going on. There's an investigation into the original shooting, believed to be by Richard Todd Forrest, and then there's obviously an internal investigation by the task team for the officer involved shooting. So there's a lot going on in this,
Hmm.
and my coworker Logan Ramsey's done a great job at kind of helping us to understand what's been going on and creating a timeline. But we don't have an identity for the person that was shot in the boat, but investigators have said that he's been released from the hospital and wasn't involved. So at this point, we're just kind of trying to keep up with it. And the Bannock County Sheriff, along with the Power County Sheriff, has said that as they investigate and they learn more about the details, that they will release it. So we're just kind of waiting for that and waiting for anything to update.
All right. Well, appreciate that update. I know that was a lot to get through. So appreciate that. Max, the State Water Resources Department has issued a cease and desist order, and this is to a McCall man who apparently clears fallen trees along Lake Fork Creek. So, any reason as to why the state decided to do this? Because, as you reported, this man's been clearing this creek for years now.
Hi, Gemma. Yeah, it's kind of a new issue. The letter was sent by the Idaho Department of Water Resources on April 3rd to Cody Monroe, who's a jet boat enthusiast that lives in McCall, and it ordered a stop to all unauthorized alteration of Lake Fork Creek, is what they quoted, and that he needs to obtain what is called a stream channel alteration permit, which is for removing dead and downed trees from below the high water mark. And the letter was addressed to Monroe specifically, but he told us that this is, something a group of local jet boaters do every year, including this year. Like, it wasn't just him out there that day. I mean, they work to clear sections of downed and dead trees, kind of from the main current of the creek. And that's for jet boaters. People in rafts can then use the creek, drift boats, paddle boards, whomever. It was really news to me that cutting out dead trees from a creek is not legal. It's something
Hmm.
that I think a lot of users have done over the years, like rafters, other people floating down the river, kind of looking to make streams and rivers safer. But yeah, IDWR did not like this activity this year.
So, Max, how does the situation tie into a broader debate in Valley County when it comes to things like mini jet boats and access to waterways?
Yeah, that's right. I don't know if this story is particularly front page news on its own, but the letter was sent really amid an ongoing discussion of mini jet boat access in Valley County. It's been a really big issue lately. In March, the Western Whitewater Association and the Idaho Recreation Council, these are two groups that advocate for motorized recreation, particularly on rivers, asked the county to roll back rules that ban these little jet boats on the North Fork of the Payette River, which is the stretch between Payette Lake and Lake Cascade. Like Valley County Code here currently
Hmm.
bans motorboats on that specific stretch, but there are no regulations for smaller creeks and streams like Lake Fork Creek. They are allowed on there. I guess you're just not allowed to cut the trees. It's
Hmm.
it's a kind of a newer issue in general because these jet boats are a newer technology. They just really haven't existed prior to 2020 when this ordinance was written. But county officials are looking into updating these waterways rules, and that could go either way. It could open up rivers to more motorized travel, or it could restrict these jet boats on these smaller tributaries like Lake Fork Creek. So I don't know. People on both sides of the issue really do care about it a great deal.
This morning, Governor Brad Little vetoed another bill. So this has made it his sixth one. And this is the most he's ever done in a single year. But he did this after the session ended, which means that lawmakers cannot override those vetoes. So, how unusual is the timing, and why did the legislature choose to adjourn instead of just waiting to see if the governor would veto any of these bills?
Yeah, Jim, that's a great question. And when I talked to Speaker of the House Mike Moyle about this yesterday, I think he has a little regret that they adjourned for the year last week rather than going at recess. And this is something that um, is not too unusual because sort of the way the legislative sessions have been playing out lately is the biggest, most controversial, most important stuff happens at the very, very end of the legislative session. Like if you looked at the first 30 to 45 days of the legislative session, there was barely any legislation that passed aside from
Hmm.
the bill to conform with the one big beautiful bill and its tax cuts. So all the important stuff, all the controversial stuff kind of gets shoved to the back end of the legislative session. And so it's not super surprising that it happened this way, but it is sort of the quirks of the process and how it works. You're exactly right that if they had gone at recess last week on Thursday and given the governor 5 days to act on all the end of the session bills, they could have come back and tried to override it. But because they adjourned for the year, they don't have that power. Speaker Moyle told me that they're not going to do this again, that if he's speaker next year, they're not going to adjourn at the end. They're going to take their time. They're going to wait for the governor to act on all the end of session bills. So they have that opportunity to override a veto. So I think that legislators have a little bit of regret for the way they chose to adjourn the session. But when I talked to Mike Moyle and when I talked to Representative Josh Tanner, Republican who chairs the
Hmm.
budget committee, they were frustrated with the governor and they didn't get into the exact specifics of what the deal entailed, but both Moyle and Tanner told me that they felt like they had sort of this gentleman's agreement with the governor before they adjourned for the year last week, where they weren't expecting any sort of quote surprises at the end of the year. I don't have anything in terms of what the exact deal looked like or what was spelled out or
Hmm.
how it was agreed to, but they did sort of express surprise and frustration at the vetoes and said, you know, we're not going to do this the same way next year. We're going to wait and we're going to let him act on it. But this has been something since there was a Supreme Court decision in like 2017, Gemma, that involved former Governor Butch Otter issuing a veto at the very end of the 2017 legislative session. So for almost a decade now, we've been under these procedures where we know that there could be the potential for these late session vetoes. And so while the Republican leaders were acting surprised and frustrated when I talked to them yesterday, I think everybody knew that it was a possibility that a veto could be coming because there were so many late session bills that weren't acted on. So they're frustrated, but everybody's known for 10 years that this could have happened, is basically what I wanted to say.
Okay, so I think it's interesting that House Speaker Moyle and Co-Chair Josh Tanner are calling this the governor breaking a gentleman's agreement.
Right.
And I know, you don't know exactly what that agreement entailed, Clark, but I'm curious, is because in their mind, the governor broke an agreement. How do you think that will impact the relationship between the governor and these, legislative Republicans moving forward? I mean, yes, we are thinking of the next session, but it will be here before we know it. But also, we're going into a big election season as well.
Yeah, I think it adds to a little bit of tension, or perhaps a lot of tension that was already there between some legislators in the Republican Party and between fellow Republican Governor Brad Little. I think back to the second day of the legislative session, Representative Tanner, the co-chair of the Budget Committee, publicly sent out a press release saying the governor's budget proposal was irresponsible and full of gimmicks. And then come to the end of the legislative session, Representative Tanner used some real similar procedures to move cash and interest payments around. And then two of those were some of the bills that the governor vetoed earlier this week. And so I think it's going to increase some tension that was already there. There's a lot of talk over the last 15, 16 years that I've been covering the legislative session about the balance of power, right? The balance of power between the legislative branch of government, which is a part-time legislature, versus the executive branch of government, which the governor controls. So there's been a lot of friction and tension between legislators and the governor's office. A lot of legislators, particularly outspoken Republicans, have publicly criticized the governor in recent years, and I think he's also voiced some frustration with the budget and revenue process that legislators have used. So I think there's some healthy tension between the two branches of government, and this is probably going to drive a little bit more of a wedge between them heading into this election year. There is some talk. Speaker Moyle told me that some legislators are talking about they'd like to call a special session to respond to the governor. They can't override the vetoes, but they could try to pass new laws, or they could try to pass bills limiting the power of the executive branch. I'm not sure how realistic that is. The legislature has that power. It would take a written request from 60% of the members from both the Idaho House and Idaho Senate to make that happen. But they've got a big primary election just over a month away. I think May 19th is the primary election.
Yeah.
So a lot of those folks are campaigning for office. I do think that emotions were high during the last half of the legislative session, and there was a lot of open disagreements and fighting about the budget process. And so there's probably still some of those nerves that people are feeling right now in the immediate aftermath of the session. And this may cool off a little bit, but I expect some of that rivalry between the different branches of government and the rivalries for control within the Republican Party to continue and intensify as we've seen in recent years, Gemma.
So, Clark, speaking of it, calling themselves back into a special session, and the fact that May 19th is the primary, and then November is the general election, is there a time limit to when they can call themselves back into session?
I'm not aware of any. That's a really good question. I'm not aware of any time limits. So yeah, it wouldn't have to necessarily be right now or right before the primary election. One thing to keep in mind, Idaho runs on a fiscal year calendar that starts over July 1st. And so we'll be ending our current fiscal year in June and starting a new one in July. And so depending on how the budget situation and the revenues shake out with the tax cuts and all of that stuff, there could be more or less of a reason to look at a special session, say later in the summer. But I'm not aware of any restrictions on the dates. We do have the next regular legislative session begins in January 2027. So it would be essentially between now and the end of the year. And I seem to remember maybe 5, 6 years ago, like a November or a December special
Something like that.
session that would have been called by the governor, but I think they can kind of happen throughout the year,
Okay,
potentially.
before we go to break, Clark, I do want to go back to some of these vetoes, because they did involve late session budget decisions, and you mentioned one of them was about moving money around to shore up the state's general fund.
Yeah.
What concerns, if any, did the governor raise about those budget maneuvers, particularly the proposal to use funds that were set aside for the state's, I believe, their 2027 payroll cycle into 2028, if I have that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. This had to do with moving some interest payments and some cash around between different funds to kind of prop up the state budget. And one of these procedures that the legislature called for was taking money that would have gone to an additional payroll period in 2028, taking that money today, if it would have been needed to avoid a budget shortfall and leave a budget surplus. The governor vetoed that. He blocked that from happening, saying what we would be risking is a really disruptive process down the road where we don't have the money available to pay for this extra payroll period that the state has. He says that he's not willing to jeopardize that process and create additional budget problems down the road. And so that was one of the examples of money being moved around, and the governor sort of rejecting that through the line item veto power there. He basically said, we're not going to take money that we're setting aside for future payroll needs to bail us out today, because that's going to create problems down the road, was sort of my read on the letter that he sent that was attached to the veto he issued earlier this week, Gemma.
All right, appreciate all of that, Clark, and thank you for giving us all the information around the
You're
legislature
welcome.
and, of course, these vetoes as well. So the Trump administration has announced a major restructuring of the U.S. Forest Service that will actually move its headquarters from Washington, D.C. to Salt Lake City, and then it will reorganize how the agency manages national forests all across the country. And Rachel, I know you've been covering this, so what is the administration's reasoning for moving the Forest Service headquarters to Salt Lake City and eliminating the agency's regional office structure?
The big reason behind this overhaul, they say, is to move leaders closer to the majority of the land they manage, which is in the West. So about 260 positions are supposed to move from DC to Salt Lake City or other offices, and then about 130 would stay in the capital. And then, like you said, in addition to moving the headquarters, the Forest Service is pivoting from this regional model to a state-based leadership one, and consolidating research operations from 5 regions across the country to just one office in Fort
Hmm.
Collins, Colorado. And the agency says these changes are to simplify the chain of command and reduce bureaucracy.
So, Rachel, with this new structure, then that means that Idaho will gain a new state director's office, and that would be headquartered in Boise. How could this change the way forests and federal lands are managed, in the West?
Yeah, so that's because of the move from a regional system to a state-based one. Not every state is set to get their own office, but Idaho is. Um, I think it's safe to say that states like Idaho will like this move, because currently Idaho's forests are split between two Forest Service regions, which are based
Hmm.
in Utah and Montana. And so with a single office in Boise, state leaders might have an easier time communicating with the agency. We could also make the agency more responsive to the desires of the state. And this system isn't completely unprecedented. The Bureau of Land Management also has more of a state-based system. So it's moving from one structure to another. But the regional system of the Forest Service has been in place for a really long time, since the early 1900s. And so there are people questioning this move away from a long-standing system, and just why
Hmm.
why it is necessary.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because my understanding is that the proposal did receive some pretty big criticism from former Forest Service leaders, as well as employee groups. So did they mention what their biggest concerns are about this restructuring and how it could impact the agency's work moving forward?
I think the biggest overall concern is that people will leave the agency. And, this announcement comes after at least 5,000 Forest Service workers have left or taken early retirement since the start of the administration. And the agency says this plan it's not a reduction in force. It's not designed to get people to quit. But people in DC, as well as people in these regional offices, in smaller research labs that are set to close, are being told that their positions will be moved. And there's still a lot of uncertainty around that. So they don't even know where they might be asked to move yet.
Mm.
Maybe it'll be fairly close by. But maybe it'll be a distance like from DC to Salt Lake City. And so, I think a lot of people are probably not going to want to move their lives and their families, even if their jobs remain elsewhere. And
Hmm.
so they might leave.
Okay, appreciate that. So, Caitlin, a large beef processing plant over in Idaho Falls abruptly shut down. What do you know about why the plant closed so suddenly, and whether these layoffs could have been anticipated earlier?
Yeah, this one kind of came out of nowhere. So we learned that the American Farmers Network, which is essentially a really big meat processing plant out in Iona, really close to Idaho Falls, kind of abruptly closed their doors last week with very little notice. So, American Farmers Network used to be called Intermountain Packing, and that's kind of what everybody in Eastern Idaho knows them as. Um, on Friday is when we started hearing about it, and we noticed a federal notice issued under the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act confirmed that 150 employees were laid off from the processing plant, and essentially the act kind of requires big employers to provide at least 60 days advance notice of major layoffs or plant closures, and
Hmm.
the notice was only filed on Friday of last week and updated on Monday. So that was a little bit concerning. My coworker Rhett Nelson spoke with a former employee who told him that he and the rest of the employees were called into a meeting with HR on Friday morning, where they received a letter telling them about ongoing challenges, about receiving and processing cattle, and basically saying that the company was closing its stores. It's shocking that they closed so abruptly, but there has been kind of a long history of problems there. Back when it was
Hmm.
Intermountain Packing, they opened in 2022, and at the time, we did a story on them and learned that they said they had the capacity to process up to 500 head of livestock a day. About 2 years later, the company was actually charged with a misdemeanor for public nuisance after people that lived around the area and honestly, people even on the other side of the city complained of this really foul odor was emanating from Intermountain Packing.
Hmm.
And basically, they found that Intermountain Packing was kind of allowing this odor that was ruining a lot of people's quality of their neighborhoods around them and around the city. Then in 2024, they also had a complaint filed against them from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, alleging a violation of the Packers and Stockyard Act, saying that they had failed to pay for almost 3,000 heads of livestock that totaled over $3.8 million. So last May, Intermountain Packing was actually bought by American Farmers Network, which is a Washington company. It's a grass fed beef supplier, and they got a new CEO. We contacted the USDA on Tuesday of this week to see if they were involved at all in the closure or if there had been any active investigations with the American Farmers Network, but we never heard back. My coworker Rhett Nelson visited the facility on Tuesday, but the gate on the outside surrounding the property was locked, so you couldn't even get up to the door.
Hmm.
But it's a pretty big layoff situation, and we are keeping up to date and trying to find out exactly what happened.
So, Caitlin, do you have any idea then what might happen to the facility next?
I have no idea. It's almost outside of Idaho Falls. It's a really big plant. It that we have these drone photos of when they opened, and it's a lot of land. So we haven't heard anything yet, but hopefully we'll hear something soon because it was a really big employer, and so we're hoping maybe something will open up that can maybe rehire these people and get them working again.
Thanks for that, Caitlin. So, Max, Valley County has approved a new financing program, and apparently it's designed to help developers fund energy efficiency and resiliency projects. And Tamarack Resort has already been planning to use it when it comes to more development. So, can you explain to us what is this program? I guess it's being called C-PACE, and how does this type of financing work for developers who want to build or maybe upgrade projects in Valley County?
Yes, yeah, thanks. I think this is an interesting story, and I had to do a lot of kind of catching up on my financial lending literacy to cover this, as I'm not an expert in the field. But yeah, CPACE is what you call it, and it stands for Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy. And what this is it's a lending program where loans are backed by the value of the property. And to use the program, a borrower records a lien against their property to back a private loan, and that lien is recorded at the county. The county's role is kind of just administrative in this. There's no financing provided by the local government whatsoever. These programs can be enacted through a city or a county. Let's see, CPACE funding, it can be used, like you said, for projects that
Mm-hmm.
improve energy efficiency, like renewable energy, water conservation, what we call resiliency, and reducing like public health or emergency response costs. The financing program is tends to be only really come into play for large projects that run in the millions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Like if the whole quality or if the whole project qualifies under those green energy or conservation rules, it could potentially fund the whole project, but most of the time it's used in as part of the funding. Like Tamarack plans to use this for just the parts of the project specific to energy infrastructure. And this has been
So
kind of,
there. Oh no,
yeah,
go
sure.
ahead. Sorry, Max.
Well, it's been just want to give a little broader context. This is kind of a new thing for Idaho. It has only been available since 2024, following the signing of the
Mm-hmm.
Commercial Property Assessed Capital Expenditure Act. Boise, Post Falls, Coeur d'Alene, Rexburg, and Blaine County are the other places it's been adopted. And it's been a long-standing program in Utah and some other states, but yeah, pretty new to Idaho.
Okay, so you mentioned a Tamarack Resort wanting to maybe use some of the funds, and they're looking at a future hotel. So, do you know anything yet about the plans? And I mean, I guess how significant this project could be?
Yeah, that was the part I was most excited about for this, to see what was going to happen next at Tamarack. But officials there have been really tight-lipped about the hotel project. All
Mm.
that they've confirmed is that a hotel is planned. But I think any big hotel being built in our area is kind of a big news, yeah, as it relates to ski areas and visitation for sure.
So, Rachel, a sweeping reorganization. We're going to go to Max real quick, actually, and try to get Rachel back with us. So, Max, let me start with you. So, there's a proposal to bring a private sauna business to a public park in McCall. And it's drawing some mixed reactions from city leaders, as you've said in your report. It got the cold shoulder, which I thought was kind of punny. So, what exactly is being proposed for this sauna business in McCall, Max, and how would it operate inside a public park?
Yes, this was a fun one to cover. The details of it were kind of crazy to me. So this would be about 1,000 square foot sauna facility that has, like, a changing room, a sauna, and a cold
Uh-huh.
plunge, and it would be placed on public property at one of the city's parks. And the locations they suggested are Legacy Park, which is the main downtown park, and Rotary Park, which is right at the mouth of the Payette River, where the lake kind of drains out. And the proposal was not received well by the council. Their main issue really was the use of public property for private benefit. And is the city getting a good deal, like a good return on that use? And more importantly, like, our taxpayers, our citizens being fleeced of their, use of the beach for that to those
Hmm.
ends. And it was an interesting one to see. The council narrowly voted to consider the proposal again in the future, but that more, I think that means talking about the public process more in the
Hmm.
future, more than it does considering approving this proposal.
Well, so I'm so curious, Max. I mean, this is a private company. How did they think that they could put it on public property?
That's something that you can do in McCall and throughout
Really?
Idaho. If there are, it's called a concessions permit. So what the council was in favor of is using these properties for a limited time. Like during the 4th of July
Hmm.
celebration, there's a food court and vendors can, rent
Oh, okay.
space along the street and it's
Hmm.
a temporary thing. And they can come and go. Having them for a week or two would be great, according to the council. But to really park a business there for the long term is they were not in favor of. We've had these contracts before. There's been a local kind of boat and jet ski rental company that operated on Legacy Beach there, and that raised a lot of concerns about fair use of the beach. Like, is it taking up more space than a private business should?
Okay. Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Learned something new. Rachel, let's talk about this sweeping reorganization of the U.S. Forest Service because it could close dozens of research facilities across the West. As the agency moves to consolidate its scientific work and then shift leadership closer to public lands. So, what is driving this restructuring of the Forest Service's research division? And I guess why does the agency say that consolidating these labs would actually improve how science supports land management?
Yeah, so in a broad view, the Forest Service currently manages research through these regional research stations. In our region, it's the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And so what they're moving from is away from that regional structure to really just a national structure based out of Fort Collins. I think they say this would reduce some redundancies, and some people I talked to said that this, more national model might make sense for certain areas of research, like maybe wildfire research, for example. But other research that these regional offices do are pretty, specific to their
Hmm.
regions, and so it's kind of unclear exactly what this will mean. And then, in addition to that consolidation in Fort Collins, the Forest Service also plans to close 57 of its 77 research facilities nationwide. And this is, a little bit separate from that plan. I think what I've heard them say is they want to like right size the amount of facilities that they need. Some of these facilities only house a very few number of researchers. But I think this part of the plan is raising a lot of concern and just uncertainty about what it will mean to remove all of these centers. The agency says that this plan will not like reduce the quantity of science it produces, that it'll still produce science across the country, but because there are so many details that haven't been announced yet about what the new organizational structure will look like, there's just a lot of uncertainty about what the potential impacts could be.
Mm. All right. Well, appreciate all of those updates. And I want to say thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. Really appreciate all of the reporting that they do. And do remember to look all of them up, folks, and you can read all of their reporting more in depth. Our panelists today has included Clark Corbin with Idaho Capital Sun, Caitlin Hart with EastIdahoNews.com, Max Silverson, editor of the Star News, and Rachel Cohen, reporter with the Mountain West News Bureau. You've been listening to the Idaho Matters podcast from Boise State Public Radio. To stay in touch, you can find quick Idaho Daily News every morning when you subscribe to the Connector podcast. Find this and other Boise State Public Radio podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.
Every day on Up First, NPR's Golden Globe-nominated morning news podcast, we bring you 3 essential stories. At the heart of each story are questions. What really happened? What really mattered? What happens next? At NPR, we stand for your right to be curious and to follow the facts. Follow Up First wherever you get your podcasts and start your day knowing what matters and why.